Hi, ladies and gentlemen. I just wanted to do a short personal ethnography sample essay overview. This is the same overview that we did in class, so if you missed class time or if you were in any of the classes that didn't quite get to this activity, this video will help you to understand how to write the narrative. We're going to look at Kelly Henning's essay from a couple years ago called Big Steve, and we're just going to dive right in. You could see that the last name and page number, the MLA formatting with her name, my name, the name of the course, and the date in this MLA format, one space, and then the title of the story with no bold or underline or anything special. She's doing that exactly right. Let's look through the first page, and you'll notice some dialogue that is intermixed with the direct methods of characterization that don't involve dialogue, appearance, action, and thought, and she does a great job with it. It says, "Hi, welcome in," I said with a smile as a man around 55 years old entered through the glass double doors of the Kansas sampler I work at while playing with the strings on his Under Armour sweatshirt. "How are you doing today?" Let's pause there and just talk for a minute about dialogue tags. So here we have a dialogue tag from I said, and of course we're not getting, there we go. So from I said down to the Under Armour sweatshirt is actually a dialogue tag that belongs to hi, welcome in. The, the phrase how are you doing today is actually its own sentence, so you're not going to have a comma here by sweatshirt. Let's continue. Great. I'm in here looking for a sweatshirt, and I called to put a couple on hold before I came in, but I really like the one you have on, the man answered as he walked closer to my position at the sales lead table at the front of the store, pointing out the Jayhawk centered between the words on my typical KU sweatshirt. "Well, you're in for some bad news," I said regrettably as I informed the man, whose name was Steve, that I had purchased my sweatshirt at the KU bookstore on campus, not at any of our locations. Let's stop there. So you can see that there is a comma here after the first line of dialogue. And then we have a really long dialogue tag, but it starts with the man answered. So this is all technically a part of this sentence. And you can see that Kelly is giving a sense of his positioning. This is a challenge that many young writers forget to add to their paper, where they have a trouble with showing the actual positioning and spacing and action. And by action, I don't mean fighting or anything like that, but the action of the movement between the various characters that can really add an element of imagery to the story. Then, if you look down here, Kelly actually makes a mistake, and we're going to see it in a little bit, but you should avoid words like well or those spacer words that people use while they kind of warm up their brain to actually spitting out the kinds of verbal language that we do when we're actually talking to each other. And so words like well and shouldn't appear in your narrative, because although those do happen, they aren't relevant to the story, and you want to cut away some of those extra parts. Not only that, but Kelly uses well 4 times in a row essentially here, and it really just gets in the way of the story. You'll also notice that she goes into some indirect dialogue. So direct dialogue is the dialogue in quotation marks. Well, you're in for some bad news. Indirect dialogue is essentially fast forwarding through some of the information. Summary dialogue is really fast forwarding. So here, we don't actually hear her inform the man. We don't hear the actual words, but we get what she said. And this is really useful when you're trying to skim ahead to the parts of the story that have tension, or if you're trying to show just basic small talk that we don't need to actually see the exact words for. Let's continue. "Well, that's all right. I'm sure we could find something here," Steve said, as his 6-foot frame shuffled even closer to my place behind the sales lead table that directly faced the front doors, separated only by another table with t-shirts piled on it. "So what year are you in at school?" Well, I'm actually still a junior in high school," I informed him as he came around the t-shirt table to stand directly in front of me. Notice the wells are happening over and over again. That's not good. What she does do a good job of is using some subtle movement to indicate kind of some tension about Steve and the indication and foreshadowing that he might be the main antagonist of this story. Steve keeps trying to physically get closer to Kelly. And so she has him at first up here, kind of walking closer to the position. Then here, his frame shuffled even closer, and then finally he came around the table and stood directly in front of her. She also notes that he's 6 foot tall, which isn't very tall for a man, but definitely indicates that he's taller than her and makes him just a little bit more menacing, like physically imposing compared to her. Let's go to page 2. While you look very mature for your age, Steve said with a strange smile as he continued to look at me. Sensing my hesitation toward reacting at the comment, he continued, "So let's see those sweatshirts you're holding for me, shall we?" I nodded and left Steve at the front of the store while I headed back toward the back room to grab the sweatshirts. As I walked towards the back, I searched through the abundant ranks of clothes and t-shirt towers that crowded the store for Skylar's large, traditionally muscular frame for some backup. Skylar was the only other person working with me that night, and I always looked forward to the nights we worked together because he was one of my coworkers that was closest to me in age. I wasn't feeling that excited to return to Steve, and I figured that if I told Skylar that I was feeling a little uncomfortable around a customer, that he would take over for me. Unable to find, and she has a little typo here, unable to find him before reaching the back room, I weighed my options. I knew that I had to continue to help Steve because of the large emphasis that the company places on customer service, but I was unsure of how to handle my own feelings of discomfort while still doing my job. Deciding that nothing could be done until I found Skylar, I grabbed the 4 sweatshirts that had been put on hold for Steve from the packed back room and headed back to the front of the store. This really gives a lot of tension, and one of the things that Kelly does a really good job of is waiting for the moments in the narrative to reveal information that's actually relevant at that time. So she's in a clothing store. We don't need to know the exact specifications of the clothing store because we can essentially fill in those blanks in our minds because we've all likely been in clothing stores. However, she does give some description of the clothing stores when they obstruct her view for Skylar, this guy who could save her from the situation. And you'll notice that she didn't give a big background dump before the story even really got going. She waited until Skylar was relevant. And part of the reason for that is because she wouldn't have thought about Skylar at all, or him not being right near her when they're working in the store until it became relevant to her. And now the fact that Skylar could come in and save her but doesn't adds to the tension of the story. Skylar is not there, he should be there, and that makes it even more ominous. Let's go back to the story. So she gets back to Steve and we have some dialogue. "All right, here we go," I said as I held up the sweatshirts for Steve to see, hoping that he'd choose one quickly and go. "See, none of those have the Jayhawk like I want, like yours. I want to go back and see what else you guys have, but you have to come," Steve said as I uncomfortably tugged on my own sweatshirt. "I'm not going to buy anything unless you pick it out, all right?" Steve added with a wink. So Steve is generally creepy, and you could see that there are some moments where there are thoughts in the story. So for instance, hoping that he'd choose one quickly and go is an indication of her thought process in the moment. One of the things she doesn't do is she doesn't have "I thought this" or "I thought that." She doesn't have dialogue tags or italics around the thoughts because she's telling the story. It's clear that everything that isn't in quotation marks are her thoughts or an indication of appearance or movement or setting. And so you don't need to try to find a punctuation, a piece of punctuation to indicate that she's having thoughts. You can just literally state them. You can see she missed a comma right here. There should have been a comma, but you have to come, comma, quotation mark, Steve said. And you'll notice that every time the camera looks at a new person, there's an indentation in a new paragraph. So here we have "all right, here we go." That's Kelly talking and Kelly's thoughts. Then we move, new paragraph. Now we're focused on Steve. See, none of those have the Jayhawk like I want. And you'll notice that this line of dialogue, "I'm not going to buy anything else unless you pick it out," is still Steve. Camera didn't change, so there's no new paragraph. Now, stylistically, you potentially could put a new paragraph at times, but it gets really confusing. And the reason you do it this way is so that it's clear who is talking beyond just the dialogue tags telling us that. Let's go to the next page. I forced a strained smile and headed back behind. Let me start over. I forced a strained smile and headed behind the counter to put the sweatshirt Steve had decided against in the go-back bin, feeling his eyes on me the entire time. When I turned around, I noted that he had moved around the counter to stand closer to me. As I tried to hide my look of surprise, I maneuvered around Steve to lead him to the back of the store where the KU section was located. Look at this kind of choreography she has for the movement. He keeps trying to close in on her. Now she actually takes an active role in trying to get a little bit away from him. And this sense of movement really adds to the tension without being really explicit about it. Remember, your readers can fill in blanks and they can understand things that you're trying to get across without being super explicit about it. Like you can just describe the scene, and because they're following you along through this story, they're going to feel the same kind of tension you felt when you were facing the situation. Continuing. Okay, so these are going to be all of our sweatshirts, I said while I gestured to the walls of KU outerwear in the corner of the store furthest from the front. Is there a specific style you're looking for? I go to a lot of KU basketball games with my son who just graduated, and it gets pretty hot in there, so I'm thinking some kind of sweatshirt without a hood, Steve said while brushing some of his graying hair out of his eyes to get a better look at his options. One of the challenges that students frequently have when they're writing dialogue is they completely zoom in on the dialogue and forget about appearance, action, and thought. One of the things I admire about Kelly's essay is she does a great job of not just essentially writing a play where there's only dialogue, but by adding little bits of movement slash action, appearance, and thought in order to make it a fully fleshed out scene. So here, the fact that Steve has gray hair makes him even creepier that he's going to be hitting on Kelly or that he's making her uncomfortable because the age difference, even though we already heard that he was 55, the fact that he has gray hair really adds a whole nother dimension to how inappropriate the situation is. Starting at the far left of the packed sweatshirt wall, Steve and I proceeded to go through all of the crew neck options, settling on 2. While we picked them out, Steve pulled up pictures on his phone, which appeared tiny in his huge hand, of him at both KU football and basketball games wearing the specific sweatshirt he was trying to replace, a standard blue sweatshirt with Kansas Jayhawks emblazoned across the chest. So again, we have appeared tiny in his huge hand, just little physical details that kind of add to the tension of the story. I lost it at a football game at the beginning of the season. We were partying on the hill, and I guess I got too drunk and forgot where I put it, Steve said, with a booming laugh that echoed across the empty store. Do you ever go to any games? And notice how they're in the back of the store, and we know that because of earlier lines. And this kind of mention of it being empty re-emphasizes just how isolated she is and how much she is at the mercy of Steve and his creepiness. Well, my family has had season tickets for football since we moved back here around when I was 10, I provided hesitantly. It's my favorite thing to do with my dad, I said, trying to play up the fact that I was underage and still attended sporting events with my parents. Oh, I'm sure you've been to parties on the hill then, Steve replied, disregarding the fact that I had already said I attended games exclusively with my family. We always go there because that's where all the sorority girls go. My eyes darted down, and I laughed uncomfortably as Steve continued, leaning casually on the t-shirt table nearest to me. Notice here how we have a new paragraph break because it focuses on Kelly specifically. Continuing. Have you thought about joining a sorority when you go to school up there? My son was in a frat, and he dated some pretty great-looking sorority girls, Steve said as the ball of tension in my stomach continued to grow. Yeah, that's not really my type of thing, I replied quietly, stepping away from Steve and slightly pressing myself into the rows of sweatshirts that lined the wall behind me. I'm more of an independent person. I love the action details here where she just really subtly talks about setting and her movement and how she's just kind of trapped right now, which adds to the tension, even though it's kind of under the surface of what's actually happening explicitly. Well, you really should think about it considering how cute you are, Steve said. As I thanked him nervously, I attempted to steer the conversation back towards clothing. So this is the closest to the one you've shown me in the pictures, I said, while holding up a navy blue sweatshirt with the University of Kansas printed across the front. Steve straightened up from his relaxed position, inspecting my choice. He seemed to consider it for a minute before pulling his phone out from his sweatpants pocket again to show me another picture, this time of him at a KU basketball game with some of the rock chalk dancers. I'm looking for a lighter color like the one I'm wearing here, Steve said. These girls really seem to like it. I laughed nervously, trying to humor Steve so that I could find him what he needed and get him out of the store as soon as possible. Steve continued despite my obvious discomfort, pointing at the picture on his phone and gesturing for me to move toward his position between two t-shirt towers for a closer look. You know these girls are only a couple of years older than you. So here we have Steve continued. So it actually is a really long dialogue tag, so I'm pretty sure this comma is correct. Continuing. I nodded quietly as Steve zoomed in on one of the dancers in the picture. Look how hot this one is, he said with a satisfied grin as I made a conscious effort to keep my feelings of disgust off of my face. Ignoring his comment, I turned back to the crowded wall of sweatshirts and grabbed a lighter colored one as Steve requested. How's this one? I asked, trying to hurry along the process. It still doesn't have the Jayhawk, and that's really what I'm looking for, Steve said, stepping towards me. Maybe I'll have to take a trip out to the bookstore like you said. I nodded quickly. Yeah, that's probably your best bet for something so specific. Well, thank you for all your help, sweetie. I'm sorry we couldn't get something picked out, Steve said while extending his arm to hold out his hand for a fist bump. Maybe next time I come in, we'll have better luck. I hesitantly bumped Steve's fist with mine as he continued to grin at me. Well, if I don't see you again, enjoy your time at KU, cutie, and you should really consider what Big Steve said about joining a sorority, he said with a wink before turning and heading towards the exit. Golly, this guy's creepy, and can I just take a note that if you put the word big in front of your name in the third person, you're going to come off as a creep. Just saying. Continuing. As he walked away from me, I felt a flood of relief at no longer having to hide my distress at the encounter which has just occurred. Hanging up the excessive amount of sweatshirts Steve had asked me to pull for him, I began to relax more and more, deciding that if any customer it should be ever here, made me feel that uncomfortable again, I would take charge and track down a male coworker to take over as soon as possible. And this story kind of just ends on a moment of realization that maybe she should deal with this in a different way next time, if at all possible. This story is really tight. It does hit the maximum. Of course, you're supposed to be at 5 pages. This is 5 pages in a line and a half, so that's fine. And so you could see how this story that took place over the course of like 15 or 20 minutes clearly filled 5 pages really easily. If you actually have all the methods of direct characterization, thought, appearance, action, and dialogue, as well as some indication of the setting and some background information as you go, you're going to be able to fill in 5 pages really quick and tell a great story. That concludes our narrative video. If you have questions or comments, let me know via email, coming into seminar, or during class time. Thank you.